the naked bride of Handan. She left her house as a newlywed wife. By morning, she was a nameless body, naked in the mud, stripped not only of her life, but of her dignity. The field lay silent on the outskirts of Handan, a stretch of farmland that rarely attracted attention. At dawn, the air was heavy, thick with the promise of rain. When the first villagers noticed something unnatural among the rows of crops, they did not approach at once. They stood still, sensing that whatever lay ahead did not belong to the living. It was a woman. She was completely naked. Her body lay twisted in the mud, limbs stiff, skin pale against the dark earth. Her hands were bound behind her back with a piece of fabric later identified as her own underwear. There were no shoes, no bag, no identification. Only bruises, dirt, and the unmistakable stillness of death. Police arrived within minutes. The area was sealed off quickly, but not before rumors began to move faster than the rain clouds overhead. A naked woman. A remote field. Early morning. In a city like Handan, speculation did not wait for facts. Initial observations raised immediate questions. There were no obvious stab wounds, no gunshot injuries, no signs of a chaotic struggle in the surrounding soil. Instead, the scene suggested restraint, control, intentional humiliation. This was not a body left behind in panic. This was a body placed. As officers documented the position of the corpse, forensic technicians noted marks on the neck and face consistent with suffocation by a soft object. The method was quiet, personal, designed to silence rather than destroy. Under her fingernails, traces of skin indicated she had fought back, at least briefly. The rain began to fall. With it came urgency. Footprints softened. Tire marks blurred. Whatever story the ground had been holding was slowly being erased. But before it vanished completely, investigators noticed something that would shift the direction of the case. This woman was young. Her hands bore no calluses of heavy labor. Her hair, though matted with dirt, was neatly trimmed. Her body showed no signs of long-term abuse or neglect. She had not been living on the streets. She had not been forgotten by society. She had been someone's wife. Within hours, her identity was confirmed. She was 24 years old, a factory worker, married for only 3 months. By every official account, she had left her home the night before for a short errand and never returned. To the public, the discovery was already being framed in familiar terms. Sexual violence, moral failure, a woman who must have done something to deserve such an end. Whispers spread quickly, reshaping her image before investigators could even notify her family. But the body did not support the rumors. There were no signs of violent sexual assault, no torn tissue, no frenzy. Instead, there was restraint, staging, and an unsettling precision. Someone had taken time. Someone had wanted this scene to be seen. As rain washed over the field, one question remained unanswered. Was this a crime of desire, a crime of opportunity, or something far colder? Because beneath the mud and silence, the body was telling a different story. One of planning, of judgment, and of a punishment carried out long before the law ever arrived. The crime scene and the silence of the body. By the time the rain stopped, the field had given up most of what it knew. Police tape cut through the farmland like a scar, enclosing a space that felt unnaturally quiet. What had been an ordinary stretch of soil hours earlier was now a temporary morgue, a place where every step was measured and every breath carried weight. The body lay where it had been found. Forensic technicians worked with urgency, but not haste. They documented the position of the limbs, the angle of the neck, the way mud clung to the skin. Her wrists were bound behind her back with a knotted strip of fabric. The knot was tight, deliberate, practiced. This was not an improvised restraint. There were no defensive wounds on her arms consistent with a prolonged fight. No fractured bones. No visible lacerations. The absence itself was telling. Cause of death was determined quickly. Mechanical asphyxiation. A soft object had been pressed against her face, depriving her of air. There were faint bruises along the jaw and cheeks, symmetrical, suggesting sustained pressure rather than a sudden blow. This was a method chosen to silence, not to mutilate. Quiet. Intimate. Controlled. Under her fingernails, technicians recovered traces of skin. She had resisted. Briefly. Enough to leave her mark on her killer, but not enough to escape. The examination continued. There were signs of sexual contact. Seminal fluid was present. But the expected indicators of violent assault were missing. No tearing. No hemorrhaging. No trauma consistent with force. The evidence suggested compliance, or at least the absence of overt violence at that stage. This contradiction unsettled investigators. Sexual crimes driven by impulse usually left chaos behind. Torn clothing. Disarray. Panic. But here, the scene was staged. The victim had been undressed after death, or during a moment of complete submission. Her clothing was missing, not scattered. Removed, not ripped. Nearby, a single red high heel was recovered from the mud. It did not belong where it was found. The heel was clean compared to the rest of the scene, as if it had been placed rather than lost. No matching shoe was discovered. Her handbag was nowhere nearby, though the soil showed signs of having been searched. Whatever valuables she carried had been taken selectively, not greedily. This was not a robbery gone wrong. The timeline was reconstructed carefully. She had left her home the previous evening, telling family members she would return shortly. She never did. The estimated time of death placed the crime well before dawn, hours before her body was discovered, which meant the killer had time. Time to move her. Time to restrain her. Time to decide what to take. Time to decide how she would be found. As the forensic report grew longer, one conclusion became unavoidable. This was not an act of chaos. It was an act of judgment. Investigators returned to the scene repeatedly over the following days, searching the surrounding area for tire tracks, footprints, or discarded items. Rain had erased much, but not everything. Subtle drag marks suggested the body had been moved a short distance before being left in the open. Whoever carried her had known the terrain well enough to avoid drawing attention. The field was chosen. Remote but visible. Isolated but discoverable. The message mattered. When the autopsy was completed, a detail emerged that would alter the emotional gravity of the case entirely. The victim was pregnant, approximately 6 weeks along. The revelation reframed everything that came before it. It eliminated certain assumptions and introduced others far more disturbing. The pregnancy showed no signs of distress related to the crime itself. It had existed quietly, unnoticed, unknown to most of those around her, including perhaps the man who would kill her. The report was delivered to the investigative team without commentary. No one spoke for several seconds. In that silence, the crime took on a different shape. This was no longer simply about sex, violence, or opportunity. This was about control. Someone had decided that this life, and the life growing inside her, should not continue. And someone had chosen to make that decision visible. Outside the forensic room, the city of Handan continued its routines. Factory shifts changed. Markets opened. Conversations spread. Rumors hardened into accusations before facts could intervene. The woman in the field was already being tried in public opinion. The body had spoken clearly, but no one was listening yet. As investigators turned from the body to the woman's life, they would discover that she had been judged long before she was killed. The woman behind the rumors. Once the body was removed from the field, the story did not slow down. It multiplied. In Handan, rumors did not wait for facts. They filled the silence left behind by the rain, spreading from factory floors to neighborhood courtyards, reshaping the dead woman into something easier to judge than to mourn. Her name was Liu Xiaoqing. She was 24 years old, a textile factory worker, married for 3 months. According to official records, she lived a quiet life. According to public opinion, she did not. By the time investigators arrived at her neighborhood, the narrative had already formed. Neighbors spoke in lowered voices. Co-workers exchanged looks before answering questions. Words like improper, suspicious, and immoral surfaced again and again, often without evidence, always with certainty. She stayed out late. She dressed too well for her salary. She must have been seeing someone. Each statement carried the same underlying verdict. She brought this upon herself. Investigators separated rumor from record. At the textile factory where Liu worked, supervisors described her as punctual and reserved. She rarely spoke about her personal life. She avoided conflict. Payroll records showed she earned modest wages, barely enough to cover rent and household expenses. The expensive clothes people whispered about turned out to be second-hand garments discarded by the factory, taken home with permission. Financial control emerged quickly as a pattern. Her salary was managed by her husband's family. She had little access to cash of her own. Requests for small personal purchases were reportedly met with scrutiny. Privacy, according to those closest to her, was a privilege she no longer possessed after marriage. The marriage itself raised quiet questions. Her husband presented himself as grieving and cooperative. He spoke of her gently, yet vaguely. When asked about the pregnancy, he appeared genuinely shocked. He claimed no knowledge of it. Whether that ignorance was real or convenient remained unclear. Her mother-in-law, however, spoke with a different tone. She described Liu as disobedient, secretive, too modern. She hinted at shame without stating it directly. To her, the pregnancy was not evidence of innocence. It was proof of betrayal. Investigators listened without interruption. They noted what was said and what was avoided. Friends from Liu's life before marriage described a woman who had been hopeful, cautious, and increasingly isolated after her wedding. Social invitations declined. Phone calls shortened. Visits reduced. Marriage, it seemed, had not expanded her world. It had narrowed it. Attention turned to her past. There had been a former boyfriend, a man named Zhao Qiang. Older, financially stable. The relationship had ended years earlier, long before her marriage. Still, his name circulated quickly once the murder became public. He was questioned. His movements were verified. Witnesses placed him elsewhere at the time of the crime. Phone records confirmed it. He cooperated fully and showed visible distress upon learning of Liu's death and pregnancy. The theory collapsed under scrutiny, but the damage lingered. Liu's reputation continued to erode with each retelling of her story. Details were twisted, timelines blurred. Sympathy was replaced with suspicion. In death, she had become an object lesson rather than a victim. The pregnancy complicated everything. Medical records confirmed it had progressed normally. There were no signs of trauma to the fetus prior to death. The pregnancy had been viable. Quiet. Hidden. It raised an unavoidable question. If this was not a crime of passion, not a robbery, not a spontaneous assault, then why was she killed? And why was her body displayed in a way that invited judgment? Investigators began to see the crime not as an explosion of violence, but as the final step in a longer process. A process where control preceded action, where reputation preceded guilt. Someone had known about the pregnancy. Someone had decided it could not continue. And someone had chosen to ensure that when her body was found, it would speak louder than any defense she could no longer give. The victim profile was no longer incomplete. It was disturbingly clear. Liu Xiaoqing had not been killed because she was reckless. She had been killed because she was vulnerable. And the most dangerous place for her had not been the field where she died. It had been the life she was expected to live. As investigators moved from rumors to suspects, they would discover that the truth was not hidden in the streets of Handan, but much closer to home. By the time investigators turned their attention to suspects, the case had already been poisoned by expectation. The public wanted a stranger, a predator, someone easy to condemn. The crime scene seemed to offer that comfort. A naked body, a remote field, sexual elements, all the familiar signals of random violence. But the investigation did not move toward the unknown. It moved inward. The first suspect was obvious. Xiao Qiang, the former boyfriend, fit the narrative too well. He had a history. He had money. He had motive, at least according to rumor. Witnesses placed him near the factory days before the murder. His name circulated loudly in local conversations. Police questioned him at length. His timeline held. Surveillance footage confirmed his location miles away during the estimated time of death. Phone records aligned. Colleagues verified his movements. His reaction to the news was emotional but unguarded. When informed of Liu's pregnancy, he showed genuine shock. The theory collapsed under evidence. Next came a familiar diversion. A local man named Liu Biao, known for petty theft and voyeuristic behavior, was brought in. His criminal record made him convenient. Shoe prints near the field loosely resembled footwear he owned. Neighbors described him as strange, dangerous, capable of anything. Under interrogation, his fear was immediate. He contradicted himself. He cried. He begged. But he could not explain the staging. He had no access to a vehicle, no connection to Liu Xiaoqing, no reason to remove her clothing carefully or bind her hands with deliberate knots. Most importantly, nothing belonging to the victim was found in his possession. He was a distraction, not a culprit. The turning point came quietly. A bicycle. It was an old Phoenix model, discovered several kilometers from the field, partially hidden near a drainage ditch. At first glance, it seemed insignificant. In a city like Handan, bicycles were everywhere. But forensic technicians noticed scratches on the frame that did not match wear from the road. They matched fingernails. Traces of blood were found near the seat post. Cleaned, but not completely. The pattern suggested transport, not escape. Someone had used the bicycle to move a restrained body, not to flee in panic. The seller who had recently repaired the bike was questioned. He hesitated. His hands bore fresh scratches. When asked who owned the bicycle, his answers shifted. He described the owner as nervous, quiet, familiar, too familiar. Fingerprints lifted from the bicycle did not match known criminals. They matched someone already interviewed. The realization did not arrive with shock. It arrived with weight. The investigation circled back to the household. The husband's movements that night were re-examined. His statements, once considered cooperative, were reanalyzed for omission rather than deception. He claimed he had slept through the night. No witnesses confirmed it. No neighbors recalled seeing him return home early. The pregnancy had been the key. Medical records showed Liu Xiaoqing had scheduled a prenatal visit days before her death. Someone close to her would have known. Someone with access to her daily life. Someone with a reason to fear the implications. Confronted with the evidence, the explanation unraveled slowly. The crime had not been impulsive. It had been planned to look like something else. Sexual humiliation was not the motive. It was camouflage. The removal of clothing, the isolated field, the absence of obvious personal connections. All were designed to redirect blame outward, toward strangers, toward men from her past, toward the unknown. The truth was far more ordinary. It lived inside the home. What investigators uncovered was not a monster hiding in the shadows, but a familiar figure acting under pressure. Pressure shaped by control, fear of exposure, and the weight of reputation. The pregnancy was not a scandal to be addressed. It was a threat to be eliminated. The staging was deliberate. So was the silence. The case file closed not with surprise, but with recognition. Recognition that the most dangerous violence is often the kind that wears a familiar face. And that justice, when it comes, rarely restores what was lost. What remained was not the question of who had killed her, but whether the punishment would be equal to the crime. The verdict was delivered without ceremony. In a courtroom stripped of drama, the facts were read one final time. The planning, the restraint, the staging, the attempt to redirect blame toward strangers and shadows. Each detail dismantled the illusion that this crime had been sudden or uncontrollable. It had been deliberate. The court acknowledged what the investigation had uncovered. This was not a crime of passion. It was not an accident born of anger. It was a calculated act shaped by fear, control, and the desire to preserve reputation at any cost. The pregnancy was central. It had been perceived as a threat, not to life but to image, to authority within the household, to a version of order that could not tolerate uncertainty or exposure. The solution chosen was irreversible. The sentence reflected that clarity. There were no cheers, no relief, only a quiet finality that settled over the room. For the family of Liu Xiaoqing, justice did not feel like victory. It felt like confirmation of something they had already lost long before her body was found in the field. Outside the courthouse, public interest faded quickly. The rumors that had once burned through the city dissolved without apology. No one retracted their accusations. No one corrected the stories they had helped create. Liu's name, once dragged through speculation, was simply replaced by the next headline. In death, she was no longer useful. The case left behind questions that no verdict could answer. Why humiliation had been chosen over silence. Why judgment had come before truth. Why the most dangerous violence had emerged not from the unknown, but from intimacy. The investigation closed with a final observation. Liu Xiaoqing had been judged twice. First by those who whispered about her life. Then by the person who decided she should not have one. The law addressed the second judgment. It could do nothing about the first. Today, the field where her body was found looks no different than any other stretch of land outside Handan. Crops grow. Seasons change. Life continues without memory. There is no marker. No sign. No acknowledgement of what happened there. But the story remains. It remains as a reminder that justice does not begin in courtrooms. It begins long before, in how societies decide who deserves protection and who does not. Liu Shaoqing did not die because she was reckless. She died because control was valued more than life. And that truth, unlike rumors, does not fade with time.